One slightly confusing aspect of the single market is that you do not have to be an EU member to belong to it. Three countries, Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, belong to a grouping called the European Economic Area, or EEA, and that gives them full access to the single market. Switzerland has a bilateral deal with the EU that provides the same thing. What this means is that all those non-EU countries accept the principles of free movement of capital, goods, services and people. Moreover, they have to comply with all laws made in Brussels, even though they have no representatives in either of the EU decision-making institutions that were discussed in the sovereignty lecture. What is more, these prosperous countries also make financial contributions to the EU. This is because a key feature of the single market is that poorer regions are granted financial assistance to enable them to adapt to a more competitive environment. Note that if they join the EU, their contributions would be even higher in order to pay for the common agricultural policy, which none of these non-EU countries participate in. Nevertheless, Norway is actually the 10th largest contributor to the EU. So why do non-EU countries accept such an arrangement where they obey, pay, and yet have no say? Well, the vast majority of their trade is with the EU. In this context, they do not want to rely on common global tariff rules negotiated by the World Trade Organization, or WTO. By historical standards, tariffs on most imported goods are extremely low, but even small tariffs can impede trade and threaten jobs. But EEA countries and Switzerland want more than just tariff-free access to EU consumers. They also want to avoid discrimination on regulatory grounds, or what are also known as non-tariff barriers. That is, governments are very creative in using rules on things such as environmental standards or product safety to protect jobs in their own countries. Companies and worker representatives often lobby hard to get such protections, as their profits and livelihoods can be at stake. Outside the single market, a Swiss pharmaceutical company, for example, might find that its drugs do not meet EU testing standards, and thus could be prevented from going on sale. The WTO arrangement on tariffs is of no help in such cases, as it does not apply to regulatory arrangements. So by agreeing to conform with all EU rules, the problem of potential discrimination via regulation cannot arise, providing certainty for business. Overall, countries accessing the single market from outside the EU trade off sovereignty for economic benefits, but without gaining any ability to influence market regulation from within. Significantly, the EU Affairs Minister of Norway, as you see in this quote here, expressed his opinion that this model for accessing the single market would not be suitable for Britain. In his words, he says, "But honestly, I have a hard time seeing the UK, with its global ambition, dedication and contributions, being comfortable with such an arrangement." Inevitably, the question then is whether the UK would need to access the single market, and if so, on what terms? If you recall, at the beginning of this lecture, there was an image from the Leave campaign indicating that it is in the EU's interests to negotiate a free trade deal with the UK if it leaves. Now, there has been a ton of debate and speculation on this very topic. The Leave side is doing its best to reassure voters that a perfectly good new trade deal is simple enough. The Remain campaign is arguing hard that anything other than the current single market arrangement would hurt British interests. The following clip illustrates the back and forth nature of predicting the UK's trade arrangements if it left the European Union. It's an interview given by Michael Gove, a member of the British government who is backing the Leave campaign. BBC radio presenter Nick Robinson puts questions to him that use arguments from the Remain side.
It's already the case as a European free trade area that extends from Iceland to the Russian border. The only country in the European landmass outside that is Belarus. We would be part of that, and we would benefit also from being able to take back control of our seat on the World Trade Organization. At the moment, Britain is represented on the WTO by the EU single representative, an ex-sociology lecturer from Sweden. I'd like to see a Britain on the WTO determining trade policy. More than that, I would like to see barriers, trade barriers, that we've erected in the EU against developing nations come down.
Would we be in the single market? Would we be in the European single market?
We would be part of a free trade zone.
We would not be in the European single market.
We would have access to the countries of the single market by being in a free trade zone.
Well, no, forgive me. A Conservative government, Margaret Thatcher it was, created the single market because there were all sorts of what she called invisible barriers. If you want to stop the City of London, for example, legal companies, not just banks, and you're a French bank or you're a German legal firm, you erect invisible barriers to trade. You say you don't meet our standards. Now, what you're saying is you would not be part of the single market and therefore have no legal protection against those barriers.
We would have the capacity to trade freely with all of the countries in the European Union, and it wouldn't be in their interests to erect barriers because, as has been pointed out repeatedly, there is a trade deficit that we have with the European Union. We sell more to them.
Forgive me, it would be perfectly in the Germans' interest to say, we don't like competition from the City of London. We don't like competition. Maybe the French banks would say, they say it now, but you would have no legal right of redress.
Well, we absolutely would have the opportunity to say to their countries and to their peoples, why would you want to have your government deliberately erect barriers that would mean that you would lose jobs, lose investment, and lose income?
Even for an expert on the subject, it is hard to assess all the claims made in such exchanges because there are so many unknown unknowns or possibilities about the future that we cannot yet grasp. The best I can do here is to use the facts about UK and EU interests to evaluate different scenarios. So here's data from the British government on the UK's trade relationship with other EU countries and the rest of the world. And this is something that Michael Gove was talking about in that clip we just watched. The figures show trade in goods on the left and trade in services on the right-hand side. The striking thing is that the UK has a significant trade deficit in goods with EU countries. By implication, therefore, the rest of the EU has an incentive to maintain trade in goods with the UK should it withdraw from the EU. That is a perfectly valid claim to make, as Michael Gove did in that clip. Similarly, the UK has a huge incentive to keep trading services, for instance banking or accounting, with the EU since Britain has a net surplus in this area. In theory then, a deal in the event of Brexit should be simple, as EU countries need a deal on goods just as the UK needs one on services. The problem in practice, however, is that negotiating with the EU on trade is extremely complex. The Commission would conduct the talks with UK representatives, but each country would have to ratify any final agreement, while the deal would also need the consent of the European Parliament. All this could take quite a lot of time and create uncertainty for business. Once outside the single market, it is the UK's financial services industry that would be hardest hit by regulatory uncertainty. This is because it is via Britain that global banks do business with the EU. There is £250 billion worth of foreign direct investment in UK financial services. By setting up subsidiaries in the UK, non-EU banks can offer financial services to the entire EU market, Now, it would be a big concession to the UK if the EU extended equal treatment of banks to a country not in the single market. It is in the context of complex EU-UK divorce talks that national governments, as well as the European Parliament, are bound to raise the issue of including free movement of people as part of a new EU-UK trade relationship. After all, countries such as Poland or Latvia that have lots of citizens working or studying in the UK will naturally want to keep those opportunities open. Already during David Cameron's renegotiation, as we will discuss in next week's lecture, these governments were very vocal in seeking to avoid employment discrimination against their citizens. Significantly, the Swiss trade deal with the EU is dependent on accepting free movement of EU citizens. Indeed, the recent attempt by the Swiss government to place limits on EU migration has been met with retaliatory action by the European Commission. And just to add more complexity to this issue of single market access, there's also the point about how the UK could negotiate terms of trade with non-EU countries whilst balancing its desire to remain connected to the EU market. And that's the subject that I will turn to now then.